So first up this hour, I'm talking about the police. Being an officer of the law is no easy profession. It takes bravery, hard work, and above all, a strong sense of public duty. You've also got to be prepared to come under plenty of criticism. Well, here to talk with us more about what it's like to be in the police is retired officer Chris Hobbs, who spent over 30 years at the Met. Chris, welcome to the programme. Thank you so much for joining me. It's really good to see you. So I'm going to ask you then, what was it like for you then, sort of growing up, and how did you come to become a police officer?
Well, strangely enough, my grandfather was a police officer, and my brother joined straight from school. I went into teaching, and I thought, as I heard more and more about what he was doing, what he was getting up to, I thought, this may be for me. So I became a special for a while, and then joined up. It was a bit delayed because I've got a wonky eye.
Have you? I can't see.
No, it's short-sighted in one eye. So I had a bit of a battle. I had to go to find the top eye specialist in the country who wrote to the Met. And at my medical for the Met, the police doctor said, well, he needn't have been quite so abusive, your specialist, in the letter that he wrote. But anyway, he gave me the nod and I was in.
That's great. Now, were the requirements to be in the police very different from what they are now?
I think they're slightly different. I think you normally had to do an entrance exam unless you got so many O-levels and A-levels, which I had. Other than that, you had to do a sort of a maths exam. You had to do an English exam to make sure you were literate. You had to pass quite a severe interview. They would put you to the test. Not with me so much, because they knew I had a brother, but some people came out of there almost shaking because they were almost trying to wind them up to see if they got a reaction. But my interview was okay, and that was it. It was training school, and from being a teacher, I was then being shouted at by instructors and marching around and learning law and doing some practical exercises that proved very useful. And then I was out there in the real world.
Now, I thought there was like a height requirement and things like that.
There used to be 5'8", which I'm well above that. So that wasn't an issue, but yes, there was, and that's all gone now. Yeah,
it's a very different force. And in the Met, what did you do? What was your main role? I know there's different types of policing that you can do.
Well, I was very lucky, and I don't think mine was really a typical career. I did my 2 years probation. I went on to the crime squad in Southall. I was at the various riots, Brixton, Southall, which were quite traumatic at the time. And then, because of work I did after the Southall riot, where I got injured, but I worked with Special Branch, who were looking at the right-wing aspect of those riots. And then I thought, this looks interesting. So I applied for Special Branch, I got in. I spent a lot of time with the Asian community from the mid-80s into the 90s. They were kind enough when I retired, even though for 10 years I hadn't really had any links with them, to give me a ceremonial sword at a Sikh temple.
Oh wow! What does that mean?
It's really a thank you for what I'd done in the 80s and 90s, because in Southall there were some periods of real tension. Sikh separatists were killing people in Southall, and then you had tensions between Sikh and Muslim youths that could have got well out of hand, but didn't, because of the way it was policed with the community leaders. No one ever got any credit for that in terms of senior officers, but it was a very tense time. And then I got involved with Jamaica, and I spent 18 months undertaking a series of deployments to Jamaica.
Really? Did you like Jamaica? I went there. I didn't like it at all.
I fell in love with the place. I completely. I did the first tour. And I thought, thank God that's over, because we were stopping their drugs exports, the crime network's drugs exports, with the Jamaican police and with our customs officers. We thought we might get shot at. We didn't. So when I came away, I thought, thank goodness. And then I thought, I really quite enjoyed that, and I liked Jamaica. And when the opportunity came to go back, I went back, and I fell in love with the place. And lots of British police officers and customs and immigration who went to Jamaica to work with the Jamaican authorities all fell under its spell. Some live there now permanently.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes we have, criminals, and very rarely we send people back to places where they may not have been, where they were born, but they say, oh, I don't know anybody in Jamaica, but actually they might prefer it. They might prefer it.
Well, that's right. It's not really as bad for deportees. There is accommodation for them in terms they are looked after, they are interviewed, they're not badly treated, there's no double jeopardy. There's the British government funded a hostel. If they haven't got family there, they are relocated and attempts are made to find them jobs. I'm assuming that's still going on. I think it is. But yes, there are obviously some contentious issues now around some deportees from Jamaica. But as a country and as a people, I loved it. But we were shocked by the poverty we saw, the garrison areas, the ghetto areas. And we did set up a little charity for Jamaica kids that was well supported by Met officers, customs and immigration. We used to have big fundraising functions. The objective was to keep kids from the very poorest areas in education. And we met the kids that we were actually helping, which was quite something. And we're still going. We don't make the money we used to, but we're still helping out Jamaican kids. And some of them have done very well. Some of them have fallen by the wayside, unfortunately. But all in all, it was a fantastic, life-changing experience out there. And the whole 32 years has been quite remarkable, but it's had its negative times as well.
So do you recognise what Priti Patel is talking about with the force and her sort of comments that she feels that it's rotten from the core?
No.
Or something that she said today?
No, I think she, like the mayor, she seems to be, keeps changing her stance on police according to what news comes out. I've still got obviously close links with the police. I often in central London see them at protests. I'm amazed at their restraint at some of these protests that are going on. The in-your-face abuse and threats that they have to take, and they do take it, we wouldn't have done, to be quite honest. I obviously see them on the streets doing stop and searches. If I see them, I watch and I see what goes on. And I think what people seem to forget is that every day Scotland Yard gets 2,000 emergency calls that have to be dealt with by officers on blue lights and two-tones. And regardless of race, colour, whatever, those police officers will be rushing there. Some of them will be hurt as a result of what they do, but they're rushing there to help people. And that is the bottom line. But obviously, like any organisation, like the NHS, like teaching, like the clergy, things go wrong, and there are people in there, in the police, that shouldn't be there, and that awful example that we had. There are questions that are going to be addressed around vetting and suitability of people for policing. They have to be looked at, but to suggest that we've got a generation or a force or a service of racist, misogynist, corrupt police officers, I think is very insulting. I think it's very demoralising. It makes their job more difficult because it makes them more liable to be attacked. And of course it's going to discourage people as well, some very good people from joining. There are obviously issues with getting people from the black community into the police. The ones that are in there, you have to admire. There's some great officers in there, but the amount of abuse they get, on Black Lives Matter, for example, terrible abuse black officers received on there. So we want these people from across various communities in the police, but you have to say, given what's the publicity and the negative publicity that goes on, you do worry about recruits. Are we going to get the right sort of recruits, and are we putting off people who will make very, very good police officers? If we were able to get them in and tell them that really, despite everything that's said, things are not that bad, you will have to take a lot of abuse, but in terms of 32 years, it's a remarkable career that can go off in any sort of direction. And you will have some tough times, but you will have some good times, and you will meet some great people in the police. But of course, you will meet people who perhaps you don't like very much.
Well, were there many when you were there?
I was thinking about this the other day, and I think I obviously worked with hundreds during my time, and I can probably think of between 30 and 40 police officers who I didn't like very much. Not that they were corrupt, not that they were overtly racist, but they were a bit abrasive, they were a bit indifferent, they weren't very passionate about what they did. Some of them were lazy and did the minimum work. So yeah, you do get people like that. And some of the senior officers, you have to say, as leaders, were dreadful, but not all of them. So yes, it's a mixture of good and bad, but the boys and girls out there at the moment that are trying to do their best against this background and still having to deal with stabbings, shootings, and people with mental health issues. 40,000 calls a year the Met have received with people in mental health crisis. I've got a very good friend of mine. She's a mental health nurse. She has been for over 30 years. She's now in triage. She deals a lot with police officers, and often they can't help police officers because there's no facilities. And she has nothing but praise for the way police officers deal with people in severe mental distress. Sometimes these officers are with these people for hours and hours, and she will praise them. The other day she was telling me about one example, dreadful example, a poor woman, completely and utterly, I say lost the plot, sounds a bit unkind, police parlance, but she was in a very distressed state, biting, kicking, head-butting, gouging, screaming, and the police were desperately trying to restrain her, trying to find somewhere for her to go. The local A&E refused to have anything to do with her, so it was left with the police for hours. My friend said the police were magnificent, trying to look after. They eventually managed to, after hours, calm her down. But it was very, very difficult for them. And this is the sort of work that goes on that people don't see. But when something goes wrong, or you've got newspapers touting for, have you had a bad experience with the police during the pandemic, phone this number. But it's the good things that happen, the lives that are saved when you've got officers going to stabbings. And we know, don't we, that if you're a black young man or youth, you're far more likely to suffer from a stabbing than you are if you're a white, 24 times more likely than a white young man or youth. But these officers go there, they're often there before the ambulance crews, the paramedics, and they save lives. They will save lives by what they do when they reach that person.
It's very sad, really, all the stabbings, but the worst thing is that they're actually stabbing each other as well, so it's more black people stabbing each other.
That's right.
And that's, people don't tend to talk about that. They say, oh, black people are more likely to get stabbed, but it's like, yes, from each other.
Well,
that's the issue.
That's right, and there are obviously reasons for that.
Of course.
And the police, where you get more stop and searches, which are controversial, where you get more stabbings, tend to be in those areas which are basically deprived, where you've got these estates where there's nothing to do, there's high school exclusions. But on some estates, you have got a partnership between people on that estate, on the Angel estate in Brixton, which is pretty notorious. But there's a lovely lady there. Her son was stabbed to death, and the police tried desperately to save him, but couldn't. She's now set up a boxing club on that estate that's incredibly popular with girls as well. And police officers go in there and help out and help with the instruction. And you think, well, that is a big step forward on that estate. I think it's Islington, something similar is happening. But there's not a lot of support for youth facilities. We know they've been closed down. Tower Hamlets, well, the other day, they're closing down more youth facilities. And again, it's the police that are having to apply the sticking plaster. And sometimes that makes them unpopular. It gets criticism. But the police are, they are saving lives on those streets, and they very rarely get credit for that, which I think is a little bit demoralising if you're a police officer. And then you obviously see this dreadful publicity.
Well, I mean, Extinction Rebellion, they're sort of, or what do they, Insulate Britain? Their handling of that wasn't particularly great.
Well, even then, people will say that, and they said that with Extinction Rebellion when it began, even though there were over 1,000 arrests at their first and I was there at their first protest. But what people don't understand is, yes, police were taken by surprise, but in order to do something, you have to get your officers there to do it. You have to then deal with the prisoners, so you've got to have prisoner transport, and you've got to have custody provision available to take the prisoners to, so they can be dealt with. And behind all that, ordinary day-to-day policing continues. So police were caught on the hop with the first Extinction Rebellion, but it got better, and hundreds were arrested. With Insulate, same sort of thing. Initially, they were caught on the hop, but now they're clearing. You still got to get police there to the junctions, but now they're clearing them pretty quickly, maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, and carting them off. But the end result, of course, is that they're releasing them under investigation. There seems to be no process, despite this injunction, which is actually going to stop them doing it again. They're not being locked up. They're not being, if they're given bail conditions, they're ignoring them. There's obviously an issue with the CPS and the judiciary that's preventing them really being firmly dealt with. And police officers really don't want to go racing onto a motorway to deal with. They want to be within their own communities, answering response calls, dealing with the day-to-day business of policing, not being out on a motorway, hauling people off, then spending hours in custody and then having to release them and seeing them back there the next day.
And of course the CPS is the Crown Prosecution Service, which doesn't seem to be supporting the police as it should do, because these people are just being released and then the police have to do the job again.
There's lots of bones of contention with the Crown Prosecution Service and the police. I think in fairness to the CPS, they've been hit by cuts as well. So you've got police officers complaining bitterly that even when they're badly assaulted, sometimes the CPS will drop the case. And the officers are, well, why are you doing this? So there's a lot of criticism of the CPS, but they have been savaged by cuts. So I think, you know, there is a bit of an excuse for them not performing, as I think probably they would wish. But it has been very difficult for them, but very frustrating for police officers when they're dealing with people that they feel should be dealt with properly within the justice system, and it's not happening.
What about Cressida Dick? Because it seems that both her and Priti Patel don't seem to be getting on, if we're to believe anything that we read. And obviously Cressida Dick has now got a job she's going to carry on in her position. What are your thoughts on her sort of managing the force? Is she doing a good job in your eyes?
Cressida Dick was my old boss. She was commander of Operation Trident. And even before I theoretically transferred to Trident, my mum died when I was out in Jamaica. And I obviously had to rush back. Jamaican police were brilliant, by the way, but I had to rush back. I wasn't technically under Cressida Dick's command. She heard about it. I got a long email from her. Didn't get it from my bosses, but I got it from her. And then a little while after that, a very good friend of mine who was an immigration officer, great immigration officer, she committed suicide. I was very upset, so was everyone who worked with her. I thought if I wasn't tied up in my work, I might have read the signs. I was very angry. And again, a long, long email from Cressida Dick. And this is typical of her. She cares about her people. I think perhaps as she's gone up through the ranks, the higher you go, the more closed off you become. You've got secretaries, you've got staff officers. So trying to actually get in touch with her as you would have been able to do normally becomes very difficult. I think possibly she's been let down by some of the people that also have high ranks. I think you could argue that the job has become maybe a bit too big for her. It's, as far as her contract's concerned, personally, I would like to have maybe seen her get the 2 years, but after a year, start looking for the successor. Get the successor in as her deputy, have a year's handover, so the one who's coming in to see exactly what's going on. And I know who all the police want, another chief constable, they all want her. Oh, maybe I shouldn't name him.
Who do they want? Go on.
Nick Adderley.
Is it?
Chief constable of Northamptonshire. Okay. He is the copper's choice. Northamptonshire wouldn't want to lose him. Because he's a little bit outspoken, I suspect he's not going to get it.
That's a shame.
He speaks his mind.
But what about you mentioned the misogyny? It's not just, I mean, there are other female officers coming out and speaking about it as well. And Priti Patel has intimated that it is an institutionalised thing. Did you get any sense of that at all?
No.
Do you think that you wouldn't, because you're male, so you might not recognise it, but the women would be more sensitive to it? Or?
The female officers I spoke with, worked with, especially when I joined, which was 1978, they really were strong characters, I have to say. They really were part of the team. We respected them if they were good officers, and most of them were. I was never aware of that being a problem, and this was in the bad old days, in inverted commas. I'm sure there are police officers, female officers, who have had negative experiences, but what you're not going to see, you've got a lot of officers, as I understand it, and ones I've spoken to, who are turning around and saying, I'm sorry, no, we don't recognise this. Yes, there may be times when there are tensions. For example, police officers go out with each other. There are relationships within teams, there are relationships at police stations, and sometimes those relationships will go wrong, sometimes those relationships will cause tensions. But what worries me where you have an inquiry is that you will get people coming forward who say, yes, I've had a bad time, maybe queuing to come forward. What you won't get are the officers, I like to think the overwhelming majority, who will say, well, I did my 30 years. Like me, I had a great time. Yes, there were bad times. Yes, I could just focus on those bad times and paint a damning picture of the Met and all its officers. But by and large, over the 30 years, I really found my service satisfying. No, I wasn't overwhelmed by misogynist police officers. I think that's a reality. Whether that will come out in a subsequent inquiry, these inquiries tend to attract people who are unhappy, not the people, perhaps the majority, who are quite content with their 25, 30 years. And certainly I met some outstanding officers in Special Branch when I went there, some very, very strong officers who were superb at what they did. Sadly, I've just seen 3 of them very recently have passed, died, which is sad because they were tremendous. And I certainly didn't see anything that concerned me when I was in Special Branch. They were equal partners, they were on protection teams, they were guarding politicians, dignitaries and so on and so forth. And they were extremely well respected. And I can only say that as I found it during my time in the Met. But yes, what's happening is damaging, but I hope the inquiry looks at not just the bad things, but the officers that were more than satisfied after 25, 30 years serving the public and working with their male colleagues.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's really good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's Nick Hobbs. So he's a retired police officer. Interesting stuff right there, isn't it? But Home Secretary Priti Patel had this to say following the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer. Recent tragic events have exposed unimaginable failures in policing. It is abhorrent that a serving police officer was able to abuse his position of power, authority and trust to commit such a horrific crime. The public have a right to know what failures enabled his continued employment as a police officer, and an inquiry will give the independent oversight needed to ensure something like this can never happen again.